Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. In this episode, I'm talking about the book Quiet by Susan Cain. The full title is Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And I'm talking with my friend, Aurora Burds Connor. Aurora, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, I'm a scientist at a university. Iggy and I went to college together and have known each other for quite a while now. I'm a mother of two, spouse of one. I live far from my family, which I think is relevant for this.
Okay, great.
And I am an extrovert.
Okay, which is going to become very relevant as we get into this book more.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So I was just looking for folks who had read this book and, it resonated with them in some way. And you were like, oh yeah, me. I've read this book. I use it. It applies to my life. And so I'm curious, when I first was sort of inquiring widely about this book, you stepped up pretty quickly. What about this book speaks to you? Like, what in this book are the ideas that you latched onto or use in your life?
So one of my children is an introvert and my spouse is an extrovert. My other child is an extrovert. And it was very clear that I didn't really know how to be as good of a parent as I could be for my other child. And so I really wanted to learn as much as I could. They were still pretty small, I would say. I mean, I read the book quite a while ago when it first came out. Relatively shy kid, a little bit anxious. And I really wanted to just see, it was so different from the way I moved through the world. I was really excited to get some better insight into how the world may be for them.
Right. That's so great. In this book, I did look it up again. It came out in 2012 originally, and I think made a big splash when it first came out. And then I think it's one of those things that's just sort of been in the ether around for a while. I think it's been maintained popularity with the two of us, but I think it's also, I hear people reference it all the time. And I think in this exact situation you're talking about where the parent either is an extrovert like yourself, you're like, oh, my kid's an introvert. Okay, wait, we work differently. And she talks about this in the book, about how you have sort of temperament and cues that you can see from little tiny babies, like less than a year old. So I'm curious if you want to share about how, like, you sort of saw your kid and the sort of personality develop a little bit. But when did you first realize that this kid was sort of reacting differently? And is this your first or your second kid? Like, did you have the other kid for comparison already?
No. So this was my first kid.
Okay.
So the classic example where I sort of went, wait a minute, this kid thinks very differently about things. I am a huge Superman fan.
Okay.
Huge Superman fan.
Great. Good to know.
Classic Christopher Reeve Superman.
Oh, okay. Old school.
Old school Superman fan. And so like a lot of the learning to read books are like superhero books in our house. And so we're reading through I can read books. And he's like, but why did Krypton blow up?
Oh, okay.
We're like, all right. So we sort of, there are a lot of ways that it's actually been framed in the canon. And so I was sort of taking the sort of like the climate change option of like, they didn't take care of their planet and it got to be so extreme that it became unsustainable and it blew up. And its sun exploded. And he's like, wait, suns explode. Like, I know suns explode. I was like, yes, you do. That's what they do. And when is our sun going to explode?
Okay. Well, there's some anxiety right there. Could you tell that was an anxious
and
moment?
Like right there, I was like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. It's not going to happen. And he's like, but it's going to happen. And
true. It will someday.
True. Like, oh boy, you're already taking this way further than anybody has a right to at the age of 4.
Okay.
So,
this is a 4-year-old being like, when is our son going to explode? Okay.
When is our son going to explode?
And
how are we going to go to a new planet, Mom?
Yeah. Well, that's a great follow-up. How are we going to save ourselves versus we're all going to die and this is terrible. So that's great. There was some hope already in 4-year-olds.
So there was some hope, but he was already, he was already really thinking through things in a big way. And I was like, okay.
Well, and so Susan Cain talks about this, that some of the sort of introvert personality traits, there's temperament, there's personality, which she kind of gets into, and, you know, those are great. So she would say temperament is what sort of you're born with a little bit, some genetics, some just sort of reactivity, and personality is sort of how the culture affects us, how we act in the world, how we interact. You know, I think some of those personality things, to me, it speaks to a little bit like, oh, we have this like first child personality or an only child personality, or, you know, like in basic ways, you know, we kind of look at how your personality is affected by birth order. You know, that's just one teeny slice of it. So, so you have your kid who's very sensitive to everyone in the world dying all of a sudden. And you're like, oh, were you like, oh, I didn't think about that? Or no big deal. It's okay. You know, it's far in the future. We're okay. We don't need to worry about that right now. How did you take that?
I mean, I tried to reassure him that it was going to be okay, but at the same time, I was also very aware of, like, I had lived with this whole storyline my whole life, and this had never worried me.
Okay, right.
I mean, so the original Christopher Reeve movie came out when I was 5, so I literally was introduced to it very much at about that same age. And I was, just like, he's really thinking about things on a much bigger scale, and he didn't let it go. Like,
okay.
It wasn't like he thought about it for the afternoon, like months.
Okay.
This coming up, and like, we'd be outside. It's a nice sunny day. And he'd be like, yeah, but it is going to explode.
Would we love to hang out with a 4-year-old who's like, oh, the sun is so great, but it's going to blow up. What are we going to do? So what did this book then, how did this inform your understanding of your kid or your relationship? Like, how did then Susan Cain's ideas, affect that, how you process what your kid was going through?
It really did. It made me then much more aware. He was, and I knew some of these things, but it really sort of put all the pieces together. He's really sensitive to clothing. He's, the tags on clothing have to come off. He wouldn't like to get too hot. Wasn't a huge fan of getting too cold, although that was a little better. Not so much spicy foods, doesn't like loud music. But at the same time, like, has favorite, like, loves AC/DC. So never know.
Right. We are unique mixes as people.
Yeah. And, but is definitely a shyer kid at school. And just sort of, I started putting it all together, and I was like, oh, wait, he's an introvert.
Oh, right. So do you feel like you came to this idea of like, oh, I have a label for this now. I have an idea. I have a little schema to put this in so I can understand this.
I mean, I guess I obviously knew it, but I just sort of didn't think that could happen to my family.
Who knew we could have an introvert? Oh, no. Yeah, right. Where did this come from?
Right.
Which is very funny because, I mean, Susan Cain does talk about how there's like heritable parts and some of the sensitivity pieces, like even in like, she talks about, I think she shares the story of you hold a little, a baby who's like less than a year old and show them something new. And if it's new and sort of surprising or a loud noise, some babies will cry or shrink away and some babies will like look and laugh, right? Like you can see this very different sort of reactivity level or loud noises, new situations, new people, like any of these things that are sort of, that's what we can test really in teeny babies is if it's new and surprising, like how does the baby process that surprise? And that sort of, even from those young ages, then develops later, I think, into some of these interesting traits you see that the kid is thinking, or the kid is looking around, or the kid's more observant, or we describe that as being shy, right? But the kid is actually maybe stepping back and thinking before they speak, or maybe
Yes.
they're just sort of watching the social dynamic around them, and they don't feel a need to be the star of the show, versus it sounds like you very quickly got in with like, I'm an extrovert. I'm like, okay, great.
Yep.
Like, even, and not that like every extrovert needs to be the star of the show, but it seems like to me, your extroversion comes out as, I can just talk in a group. I can just say what I think. I can just get my ideas out there. We're maybe louder. We're chatty. We're like, there's a lot of verbal interaction, a lot of that happening,
Right.
but not, this kid's maybe a little quieter in that.
Totally
that
quieter. And wouldn't want to go up to a group of people necessarily they didn't know.
Sure.
But then as a scientist, learning more and reading more and doing my research on things like really was very insightful. Learning things like Al Gore is an introvert, but when he starts talking about climate change, it's something he's so passionate about that helps him to overcome his introversion, and is a fantastic speaker about that topic because it is his thing.
Right. Yeah, he's super committed. Right.
Right. Absolutely. And so just seeing that type of example and display of how it works, and it made me think a lot more about the people I work with.
Okay.
More about, because for my kids, we're obviously talking a lot about what kind of things do you want to do when you grow up, or what do you like, or what, all of this kind of things. But then thinking about the people I work with, as a scientist, I do work with a lot of introverts.
Sure. This is like a stereotype, right? Of scientists would rather be in the lab working on their thing, quiet space, closed doors,
space.
The stereotype that we have of the scientist mind, right? Focus. And Susan Cain would say that gives you space to be really, really focused on one thing and do the thing that you're working on and give it your full attention.
Right. And so thinking more then about what is going on in the meetings I'm having with other scientists. It's not that people don't have good ideas, because obviously they do. But the way the tide changes in a meeting with people who are processing versus the people who are leading forward with their ideas, made me think a lot more about, in the book, she talks about how groupthink doesn't always come up with the best ideas because the group has to collectively do things, which just isn't the most efficient way to always get anything done.
Oh yeah.
Certainly
she talks
not
a lot
innovate.
about how we're biased toward this sort of extrovert personality as as sort of an ideal in American culture. This is not true,
Everywhere.
globally, but in American culture, we are like, oh, they talk loud, they talk fast, they talk first. Cool. They must be really smart. They must know what's going on. They're a great leader, which is 100% not, there's no actual connection between talking loud, fast, and first and being intelligent and, having the best idea. But we have this bias, like, oh, they talked first, they spoke first. They must be, it's just an interesting bias that we see. And it's really funny. She tears it apart to be like, those introverts, they're thinking a little more, also have great ideas, but they get, pushed to the side, or they get sort of buried underneath the volume or the mass of ideas that come out of extroverts' mouths. So absolutely, like, she makes it basically the argument that we actually have worse ideas when we were following extroverts because they're just loud, fast, and first, not thoughtful, like deeper thinking, which is also slower and, maybe just better, ideas from other folks. And so when we have groups that work together, she would say that bias gets even more amplified. Like, oh, you talked loudest and first. Oh, here's my idea to support your idea. Here's my, so then suddenly we're all in support of this loud, fast, first idea when our quieter, processing, thinking, observing, more introverted minds have great ideas, but they're, like the little squeak, that underneath an avalanche of other ideas.
Absolutely.
Do you see what else from Susan Cain's work do you see in action in your life, or have you used any of her ideas in terms of how you act or interact with your colleagues or your kid or any of these spaces?
So I think I've changed a lot of my interactions. First, starting at home, trying to be less loud. I'm also a coach for my kids' soccer teams and baseball teams and softball teams. Mm-hmm. And I have a tendency to be the yeller.
Okay. Which serves a purpose. It's useful and very helpful in some situations, right?
Yes, it can be pretty chaotic out there. But I really try to be aware that for some kids, that's enough to just shut them down. The opposite of having them hear me is if I'm too loud, it's too much for them, and they won't be able to focus on taking in the information. I'm processing it into whatever play is going on or whatever reaction needs to happen quickly. And they need to be able to just hear it. Often they only need it once.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah.
And so I do have to really try and scale back and alternate sort of how I'm expressing a lot of exciting things that are happening at a fast pace. Which thankfully doesn't really happen at work very much, but I do find it happens outside a lot more.
Oh yeah, I can definitely imagine coaching a group when you want a player to move somewhere and you're just yelling at them to move there, and they're like, run. Too much, to even take in. Interesting, right?
Similarly, so soccer, as far as for my kids, soccer was much more of an extrovert child sport.
Okay.
There's a lot going on. There's a whole lot of chaos. There's not, especially at the young age, there's not a lot of rules. There's not a lot of predictability.
Not a lot of strategy to that one. Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
Heaven forbid you get the ball. Everyone comes to you all of a sudden.
Right.
And so it suddenly made sense why my introverted child enjoyed doing the drills, but not the games.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Because with the drill, you know what's going to happen. You can focus. You've got a very specific goal. It only relies on what you're doing.
Yeah, you got your part. It's clear.
It's your part. Maybe you're paired up with one other person. Okay, no problem. Whereas, the game was just utter chaos.
Right.
So
that's fascinating. Yeah.
So it was a good way to step back and say, I can see why the kid is not really enjoying this sport. Let's find something that is a lot less of the chaos. Baseball is a very individual sport played as a team.
Right. Okay. Sure.
So here, let's give this a try. And yes, a decade later, still playing baseball.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I can definitely see the difference in terms of, like, there's not a lot of, there's moments of really dynamic action, but it's all very clear. Right. Like, I need to get the ball from here to here, or I need to get myself from here to there. Like, it's very straightforward.
And there's a lot of planning. Like, if the ball goes here, my job is to go there. If
this happens, here's what I do. A lot of that. Right. Definitely. Fascinating. And I never thought of baseball as an introvert friendly sport. I was thinking like swimming, right? So you're just like in your lane doing your thing.
Totally true.
But which is much more of an individual sport, or running, like very hyper individual, But as a team sport, baseball is very individual too. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So definitely applying the book in a lot of ways, just to really make me step back and say, maybe if I reframe this, it explains a lot better what's going on and how to make things easier on my family, on the people around me, and on even sort of the dynamics of when I give a presentation. I do a lot more pausing when I give a presentation, which I think was probably always a better idea that I wasn't doing before anyway. But giving time for people who are thinking a lot to have the time to think before I move on to a new topic.
Right. Absolutely. I've definitely taken how she approaches, that idea of providing thinking time. And I think from her, like, I read something about how to do better brainstorming, essentially. Like, if we want to generate a lot of ideas, you're far better off giving people the prompt ahead of time, like the day before, a week before, a month before. It doesn't even matter. So at the meeting, the people who have been thinking about it are ready. They have their ideas ready. And in the meeting, probably the extroverts who are just going to blabber whatever they're going to blabber are also ready. It basically helps set up your introverts to give them that sort of lead time. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to talk about this thing. Great. I want ideas about this, whatever it is. So you can really tangibly design things, like you were saying, to really support those introverts and that processing style without, and I think she talks a little bit in the book about, you need to really hold back the extroverts sometimes. They're just they're out there, and you need to put the brakes on for them to give the introverts space and to give the introverts time and to get those voices amplified and into that group or into that conversation more. And I've definitely have worked in groups where I worked with the sports team actually, and one of the players was like, I'm going to be not the first person to answer first today. I'm like, that is a great goal for you. This very extroverted personality. Just, whenever something happens, they're like, blah, 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 and they fine, it was great, their ideas were great, but they intentionally realized that they were limiting whatever other people's participation or other people's ability to get their ideas out there because they always spoke first. And so I could see her just like holding herself back, being like, okay, I just need to not be the first person to answer. I'm like, that's great. That's really like dedication to like engaging the team in a different way, or engaging more team members. And so there are ways you can do that within meetings as the meeting leader, for sure, and provide that space, or making sure you call on the introverts who have something to share. Like, you can tell they might not raise their hand or, whatever, kind of chime in. But that doesn't mean they're not thinking, they're not processing, and don't have amazing, great ideas. But how to create that space for them where they feel like they can share or can offer their ideas or bring them forward without judgment, without, just the same way an extrovert can blabber their ideas out there without judgment or without, ridicule or whatever that might happen in that culture.
Yeah. I'm often a first talker in meetings. And that is, it is something to actively try not to do. It's hard for me.
Well, and you probably have great ideas. You're like, this has worked many millions of times for me. I'm amazing. Like, I don't think you're that egotistical to be like, all my ideas are the best ever. But you have good ideas. You have like have things to offer. And so of course you're excited to get them out there. And I think it sounds like you also are like, I know I need to make space or invite in the introverts, maybe invite to participate in different ways.
Try. Yes. Well, and I do think this is a bit of a tangent, but I do think it's also harder for women to think about that. I mean, I think to get ahead in academics and in classes, I really did have to just jump in a lot of the time. And that I think I was praised because I was a girl who was speaking up. So that got reinforced.
Right.
But I also felt like if I didn't jump in first, it was just going to be a wash of guys' ideas, and then I wouldn't get anything in.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suspect that was like accentuated by being one of the few or only women in the room, right?
Yes.
Like, I've heard this dynamic before, being the person who's the only one in the room has to suddenly be like fit within this really confined cultural dynamic of what it means to be a good member of that little space or that community. And if it is talking first, like, yeah, you better do that, or else you'll just be ignored or pushed to the side, maybe potentially. That's fascinating. I think she also talks about how people, like, we cater to extroverts a little bit in our society, and we sort of ignore introverts a little bit, but you can be a well-adapted introvert. And it's not, this is like a spectrum, right? There's not just like one or the other. There's sort of a mix and a blend in between. And I think it's actually situational for some people. Like, I'm sure there are plenty of middle schoolers who are super shy, then later like they find their groove and you're like, oh, in high school I found my friend group, my group, I'm not this shy little wallflower anymore, like whatever. This is a sort of classic like development arc of every movie that involves teenagers. But I think there's also that as we evolve in society too, like you're very aware that in this like academic setting and science settings that you need to get your voice out there. And so, that's reinforcing your already extroverted tendencies and probably amplifying them. Like they're rewarded, they're amplified. So. And for our more introverted folks, finding their spot, finding their pace, but also understanding how to, we call in introverts. She would say, Susan Cain says that we ask introverts to do the bridging of that gap a lot more often than we ask extroverts to do it, like just in broad strokes, right? And so introverts are called on to get their voice out there more, or to step up a little more, or to, raise their hand a little more than they would maybe feel inclined to do, because we want them to act more like extroverts, and which is not awesome, broadly speaking. Like, hey, act more like who you're not so that you fit in. Generally not a super great message. But the reality is that's what happens. Like that we ask introverts to bridge that gap, and we ask introverts to step up more often than we ask extroverts to like hold back or, create space. And I think this is changing with time. I've seen it evolve over time where people are like, oh, I need to actually have an introvert friendly meeting. An introvert, that things being introvert friendly is a part of sort of the ether out there a little bit. That we're like, oh yeah, I need to pay attention to this. I actually want all the ideas, or I actually want everyone to be involved. How do I set this up so my quieter people can get their ideas out and my louder people don't steamroll, the whole situation? Have you seen that evolve over time for you in your world? Or is it pretty much like, oh no, this is like the extrovert party town where I work?
Well, I think a lot has really changed with COVID, because the meetings are no longer in person. I mean, they are again sometimes in person, but they're people are just a whole lot more away. I don't know. We've all taken up tendencies, I think, that help people who are introverted.
Yeah, I've heard that COVID was like an introvert fiesta, basically. Like, cool. Yeah, I get to work at home. I get to close out all my work coworkers, throw a party. This is like ideal for many introverts, if that's the situation that they've suddenly found themselves in, versus an open office, which I would think would drive most introverts crazy, or a very chatty, collegial type of environment where people are always in each other's space kind of thing.
Right. I mean, if I meet someone now, I don't go up to shake their hand. I still don't. I still keep a little bit of distance, which I recognize must be so much better for a lot of people who weren't comfortable with, who really wanted a more large personal bubble to begin with, but had adapted themselves to, all right, new people are just going to come right up at me. That's the way it goes.
Right.
And, we don't have these social hours with extra food, and you're supposed to hang out after work and try and
the networking,
and
which is like the chaos of the soccer field for a lot of people, where people are just mingling around. We don't know what's going on. There's some snacks. There's a ball on the field. There's a goal somewhere. Everyone's just roaming everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things have all gone away. We go on Zoom meetings, and afterwards, there's always or I think we've learned now, somebody's been taking notes, but at the same time, they say, all right, these notes are going to be put into a Dropbox or a Google Sheet or whatever. Please add in more from your perception of the talk, or things you've added, or things you thought of during the process. And so that's become a really good way to let things percolate, and become part of the product of the meeting that would have been usually completely missed before.
Oh yeah, like I had thought about that, like just the asynchronous work, that suddenly this is a thing we do. In the past, we did it during a meeting together, all at the same time. But now we have just that whole, again, like a new word, a new idea for how we operate, like asynchronously, which before I don't think was really the thing that it is now, when you can have an online piece here and a live piece there and a meeting
Right.
or a document or something to sort of chime in on, that it doesn't matter when you do it. Like, and because
Mhm.
no one else is around, you get to do that sort of on your own agenda or in your own space or time.
Right.
Yeah, I think a lot of extroverts have suffered during COVID for a lot of those reasons too, where suddenly they're like, hey guys, anyone, like, hello.
Yes.
Like a little more, that isolation is maybe not leading to that thriving interconnectivity and energetic kind of space that a lot of extroverts thrive in, right?
Right. Yeah, I was incredibly demoralized when I had to shut down all of my research and go home.
Oh, I bet.
Like loss of self-identity, loss of everything.
Yeah.
Because working in a vacuum from home was just like the worst possible scenario I could probably think of in terms of still being able to work.
Right.
Oof.
And you've survived, so good.
And it's all come out the other side for the most part.
But that's hard. I think we don't always appreciate how hard this has been on extroverts. They're like, oh yeah, you could just chat with someone on Zoom, but like you can't. Like it's not the same.
It's not the same. And at the beginning, we didn't know how very well.
Yeah. We've faltered a lot through a lot of things. It's true.
But learning how to do a lot of things when the person isn't right with you was really hard for me to adapt to, because I was so accustomed to feeding off their energy, feeding off their excitement for their project. A big part of leading a scientific team is sort of to be the cheerleader, and helping them to not get too upset when it doesn't work, and really pushing through and all of the joys and excitements, and not being in person really took away a big skill that I used a lot more than I thought I had.
Interesting. So you just became more aware of that by losing it. Well, this is
by not having it. Yeah.
Right. It's interesting that part of the role for you as the extroverted scientist, right? Versus a stereotypical introvert, like just leave me alone with my, my work kind of scientist, is that you are connecting and supporting. And I'm sure all your people were like, oh yeah, we know that Aurora is going to roll in and like tell us what's, connect with us, tell us we're doing a good job, give us ideas, blah, blah, like they'll interact with us and support us in various ways. Fascinating. And have you talked with your teammates? Do they miss that too? Or did you hear from them? Or were they like, woo, good, you're out of my grill? I'm curious how that came out on their side.
Well, at first we literally had to shut down all of our experiments. So we were all upset because we just weren't able to do our work.
Science is over.
That was awful. Like,
that's brutal.
All right, go write some papers and do some online research. Like, it's basically like being assigned something for a science class.
Right. Like go write a report. And you're like,
go write a report on stuff that other people have done. Oh, no.
Yeah.
But once we started getting back together, it was really interesting to see the people who, for one reason or another, wanted to work at times when there were fewer people in the lab. And I totally get there were a ton of different reasons for that. Some of them had to do with COVID safety, but I think a lot of them have to do with a lot of what was in the book, where she was like, and it's the classic, it was me in grad school too. You wake up at noon, maybe some good ideas start happening by 4:00. By the time the sun goes down, things are moving. Let's do some stuff.
Right.
And like all of the best work got done at night. And that is very classically true in my building, in my department. If you go at 2 a.m, half of the lights in the building are still on because people are cranking away. They've got their whatever their music is. There's nobody else around. And they're in their groove.
So has your workspace operated more So it sounds like the hours may have changed. Like before, perhaps it was you were 9 to 5, whatever, kind of like on a schedule. But now that to accommodate more people, the hours are more open. Or did you always sort of have that people could come in at different times, but now it's just a lot more obvious?
You could always come in at different times. Sort of as one of the group leaders, and as a parent, I tended to be there more normal hours.
Right.
But certainly grad students, postdocs, it was always whatever worked for you. But there was a distinct 6 months probably during COVID where we had to have limits on the number of people in a specific room. And so we had to split up the times. Like people had the morning shift or they had the afternoon shift. And you could trade your times if you had an experiment, but it was very engineered for like no more than 3 people in a room.
Absolutely.
And that room used to hold 8 people. So,
right.
So there was purposeful spacing, but even outside of that, then some people said, you know what, I'm really good with the 10 p.m. to 6 spot.
Wow. Good on you. Night owls, like have at it.
Great.
Interesting. And I think that's so fascinating that you connect that with not just sort of, oh, they're a night owl, they're a morning person, but that's like the introvert who's like, I don't want to be around people. I don't need to be around people, maybe. And I suspect the people that most wanted or needed to be around others look at that schedule and look at when are the most people here, that's when I'm going. I suspect there were some of your people that was their sort of decision making. Other people, when are the least people here, when is no one here, that's when I'm going. Like that's how I'm gonna serve myself well and serve how I process and think and how I do my best work. Right.
And I think in the beginning there may have been some people who weren't sure what was going to really necessarily work, but then as those changing of times became more optional, where you could flex your own time as needed, it was interesting to see how many people continued with the alternative flex times.
Well, I think we're seeing this now in our world when some spaces are like, cool, we're no more work at home. You're all coming in, and all the introverts start, are crying inside because they suddenly have to come back in. Or you used to be able to have this flexibility. Now we're clamping down on this there's actually no good reason to all, if your work was happening just as well remotely versus in person, there's no reason to be in person. Similarly to time, 9 to 5, whatever, a time schedule. Yeah. If your work can happen just as well without that time schedule, there's no need to force that on people. And I think we're seeing the sort of second bump of resignations when people are like, actually, I don't want to go back to how it was before, because this freedom of schedule, this freedom of space usage, a lot of these things, the forced lack of crowding in some spaces has been really, really supportive of some people's introversion and their introvert like mentality and how they operate and probably how they feel. And so being forced to go back and kind of revert to some of these things that didn't serve them well. If it's done in a really draconian way, people are out of there. Like that's just not going to, I think people aren't going to tolerate that because other places are like, oh, wow, we just learned that we don't need an office. We don't have an office anymore. Perfect. People, you're free, whatever. And it depends on obviously the work you're doing and what you need to have happen. But some organizations have gone full remote from here and some have gone, great, we're back to in person. And that's not landing well. Like for everyone, for sure, not landing well.
Yeah. As an extrovert who likes to butterfly around a lot, I really do appreciate, we have a system where everyone comes in at least 2 Wednesdays a month.
That's great. So minimal. That's like, some people are like, you have to be here 4 days a week. And so you're like, 2 Wednesdays a month. Great. That's fantastic. So so it's for you knowing if you're there on all the Wednesdays, you're like, I'm going to see everyone at some point.
Right.
Like, I can make it happen.
Right. I have this question for him and like, it would be really complicated to type it all out. Yeah. But if I just stop by and say, all right, here's the situation. What should I do? Or how do I fix this? Or what do you think? So much easier for me than trying to do it remotely. So knowing that people who normally are at home will at least be in some of the Wednesdays.
Right. That's a great
It's
schedule.
really great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It sounds like a good, I don't know how you came up with that policy or that schedule or whatever, but it sounds like it's in some ways the best of both worlds. So that only for the introverts are like, ugh, I only have to do this 2 days a month. And for the extroverts, like, yay, I get to see everyone at least 2 days a month. You know,
Right.
There's sort of, I can see sort of that being acceptable, you know, to sort of both stereotypical groups, right? You know, that we're talking about a little bit. That's fun. That's a great way to, and I think, I'm curious, you know, over time, we're too close. We should follow up in like a year. From the scientist point of view, if work productivity then is affected, you know, it's hard because everything got shut down, like you were saying, and
everything is still just weird. Yeah.
So maybe it's not easy to compare, but I think as you get back to whatever the normal is that's going to be happening, I'm curious if people will feel more supported and do better work over time. Like theoretically, according to Susan Cain, you're setting people up to do their best work because they can operate on a schedule that more often works for them in various ways. So theoretically, better work should be done, more work, you know, more, you know, whatever better means in your life and time. So I'm curious how that will play out now that you've come to the space of accommodating both the extroverts and the introverts together and making that, sort of a happy medium or whatever, or the first iteration of what the happy medium will be, you know, whatever that looks like down the road.
Absolutely. It's a process.
Good luck is what I was going to say with all of that. Are there any other pieces or hot topics from this book that you want to make sure that we cover before we wrap up for today?
Nothing comes to mind. How about you?
I think we've gotten to all the things that are really interesting to me or that I've used for sure. Like well, I guess for me, my field is more leadership. And so she explicitly says that introverts make great leaders. I'm like, yes, exactly. And it's a different sort of pace to the extrovert leader, the stereotypical extrovert leader.
Yeah.
And extroverts can be fine leaders too, but not to overlook the introverts in leadership roles. And, you know, she whips out some stats with like this many CEOs of this many 500, you know, Fortune 500 companies. Like the introverts perform, you know, whatever. She has stats for that if you want stats for that. We tend to have more extroverted leaders, again, for the biases and the reasons we have. But our introverted leaders tend to perform better in the studies that she's done. So I love that little piece of information because I think I work with a lot of leaders who are maybe they feel that pull as an introvert or they feel that personality and they're like, oh, I get talked over. So I don't get the promotion. So I don't get, you know, moved up. But I have great ideas. But I have this. How do I carve out a space for myself without selling out? You know, sometimes they feel like, I need to sell out to be an extrovert, and that doesn't feel really great all the time. But how to, you know, again, we're calling on these introverts to adapt and bridge these gaps sometimes. So, yeah, that was the other piece I think that stuck out to me from this, that even if you are an introvert or even if you are an extrovert, you can be a great leader. And I'm sure both can be kind of garbage leaders. Like we all know that. But not to overlook the power of introverts, again, as like the title is, in to be great leaders and to be great participants in all the things that we casually bias toward extroverts for in our world. But yeah, it's been great talking with you today, Aurora. Thanks so much for making this happen.
Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. We'll talk to you later.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.